Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 332. And this time I'm going to talk about this record, which originally came out in 1964 on Blue Note, A New Perspective, Band and Voices by Donald Byrd. What I have here is a 1966 Blue Note Liberty Records, that's when the buyout had happened, pressing, which has a kind of serrated edge to the record, strangely. Now, Donald Byrd is a key figure in hard bop in the more Afrocentric jazz explorations of the 1960s, in the jazz funk world of the 1970s, and he even ventures into disco. In each of those eras, well, maybe not the disco era, but all the rest of them, his output was high in quantity but also in quality, although the critics were not always along for the ride. Perhaps because he was a darling of the hard bop scene of the 1950s, his forays into fat, funky beats in the 1970s were kind of looked upon with scorn by the mainstream critics, even though records like Ethiopian Nights are some of the best music, in my view, of the era. But this record is from an earlier period, at a key point in his career. He was always a very cerebral musician. He had a great interest in education, of which he acquired a lot in teaching and research into music. And at this point, despite the fact that he's an established Blue Note star, he's beginning to cast off from the good ship hard bop and exploring different sounds, which would eventually take him to the electric funky jazz of the 1970s. He's only 31 years of age in this record, but it's his 24th LP as a leader, his eighth for Blue Note, and it's a significant departure from the established Blue Note style of the day. The conception of the record is not all his own doing. It's kind of a collaboration between Byrd and the pianist, composer, and arranger Duke Pearson. The results, in my view, are a great success with some nice surprises and some masterful examples of a whole bunch of different jazz styles. Donald Byrd was born in Detroit in 1932. His dad was a Methodist minister, and both he and Donald's mother took an active interest in Donald's education, both his scholarly education and his musical one. And he was already playing trumpet by the time he got to high school, thanks to a gift of a trumpet from his uncle. Like so many young, talented musicians of the era from Detroit's black community, he ends up at Cass Technical High School. As high school music programs go, there were probably few better in the whole of the United States, but even so, Donald's proficiency in trumpet stood out. And before he graduates, he's already making recordings, initially with a local group called the Robert Barnes Sextet. After high school, he stays in Detroit and studies music at Wayne State. His studies are interrupted for a couple of years by a stint in the Air Force. When he comes back, graduates in 1954, and soon after, he makes his first record as a leader. That record was Byrd Jazz, made in the summer of 1955 for Tom Wilson's Transitions jazz label, using other prominent Detroit jazz musicians like Barry Harris and Yusuf Lateef as sidemen. In the fall of 1955, Byrd decides to enroll again in university, this time in a graduate program at the Manhattan School of Music in New York. When he arrived in New York, his first regular gig was in a group led by George Wellington. But he was soon spotted and then recruited by Art Blakey, who, along with Horace Silver, had recently started the Jazz Messengers, basically the seminal hard bop group of the era. Clifford Brown had been the original trumpeter in the Jazz Messengers, but he was not too keen on some aspects of the group, like Blakey's personal habits, and so he went off to form a group with Max Roach. So here was a great opportunity for Byrd to step into the shoes of one of his idols. Donald didn't stay long with the Jazz Messengers. Just like Brown, the heavy heroin use in the band wasn't really his scene, but he did stay long enough to get a lot of exposure and basically become a name on the New York scene. This visibility, along with his tidy personal life and his immense musical knowledge, made him extremely attractive to producers, and he soon began recording regularly. Between the end of 1955 and the summer of 1957, he makes no fewer than 12 records as a leader and a whole bunch more as a sideman, particularly for prestige. The dozen records he made as a leader are made for no fewer than 8 different jazz labels, and between that work, his work as a sideman, and his nightclub work, within 2 years, he had basically played with the entire jazz establishment in New York. In that time, excepting the few months that he spent with the Jazz Messengers, he was mainly a free agent. After touring Europe in 1958 with the sax player Bobby Jaspar, when he came back to New York, he decides to form his own quintet. Along with Pepper Adams on baritone sax, he formed a group which would last for 3 years, and this period also coincides with the end of his label hopping because Alfred Lyon of Blue Note signs him to an exclusive deal with Blue Note in 1958, and that was an arrangement which would last in total 18 years. That Byrd-Adams quintet made some of the finest hard bop of the era, often augmenting their 5-piece lineup with other players in the studio. One regular member of that quintet was Duke Pearson, who, as I mentioned, played piano but also composed and arranged. And so, together with Byrd and his musical knowledge, that quintet has some serious creative and theoretical chops. They made some great recordings, including Bird in Hand, Catwalk, Royal Flush, and Freeform, and those last 2 records are also notable for being Herbie Hancock's first outings on record. In fact, in addition to being given this break, Herbie was mentored by Byrd through much of his early mid career, and it's maybe no accident that both of them go through phases of being disparaged as sellouts by the jazz intelligentsia later on in their careers. This group with Adams was Byrd's most successful venture to date, but given his own musical curiosity, as the 50s turned into the 60s, he was not going to be happy just churning out hard bop date after hard bop date. In January 1962, he leaves New York for Paris, or more accurately, the American Conservatory down at Fontainebleau, where he studied for a year under Nadia Boulanger, a musical theorist and teacher who had trained the cream of French musical talent since 1900. Following his time in this very different and stimulating environment, Byrd returns to New York at the end of 1962, reconnects with Duke Pearson, and with Duke begins to plot out this record, and in particular doing something a little bit different than they had done before. This record is made on January 12, 1963, at the Van Gelder studio in Englewood Cliffs, with Rudy working the dials and the sliders and Alfred Lyon in the producer's chair. Byrd, of course, is on trumpet, and although, as I mentioned, he'd been reunited with Duke Pearson, Duke doesn't play piano in here, he sticks to composing and arranging. Herbie Hancock, who is just at this point in his career on the cusp of joining Miles Davis, is the person on the keyboard. The other horn on the date, a tenor sax, is played by Blue Note regular Hank Mobley, who, ironically enough, had only just recently been ditched by Miles Davis in favor of Wayne Shorter. Byrd's fellow Detroit native Kenny Burrell is on guitar, and the rhythm section includes Butch Warren on bass, Lex Humphreys on drums, and Donald Best on vibes. So far, so familiar, but the novel approach here is the inclusion of an 8-person choir. The choir is directed by Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, but none of the choir members get a credit on the sleeve. You'll often read about this record that this is a gospel choir, and I guess there's some elements of that, but to me, it doesn't sound gospel-y. It sounds a lot more commercial, a lot more kind of Hollywood, almost TV show style choral work, which isn't a bad thing because the contrast between the A-list hard boppers on here and this choir, it could be cheesy, but actually the contrast really works. It's very effective, and it keeps the whole record totally fresh. The record would be released in 1964, and it kind of kicks off a sequence in the rest of the 1960s for Byrd, where he's interspersing periods of education and teaching with much more occasional time in the recording studio, making records which are veering further and further away from hard bop and closer towards the African-inspired beats of his 1970s output. The two tracks on side one are both Donald Byrd compositions, and the first of those is Elijah, and right away the choir tells you something is quite different from the music we've heard Donald Byrd playing before. One additional thing about this piece, which really does give it a different feel, is Lex Humphrey's use of his cymbals, which gives the whole track almost a wall of sound feeling. Mobley's solo is a thing of beauty, so is Byrd's, and then by the time Hancock comes in, the whole track has this gloriously kind of unconstrained feeling. What's been achieved here is a sense of spontaneity, despite the fact that at least 11 and probably more different musical parts had to be arranged. On Beast of Burden, Hancock sets the tone early for what is basically a chilled out blues track, and his playing here is as bluesy as anything in his whole catalog. Side 2 starts with the first of two Duke Pearson compositions, and it's called Cristo Redentor. This is, for my money, the best track on the record, and one of the very best tracks, I think, in the whole Blue Note catalog. It was inspired by a trip that Pearson took to Rio. He said he felt much closer to religion seeing the big statue of Christ. Most U.S. musical tourists to Rio around this time hurried home and made a bossa nova record. Not Pearson. What he has come up with here is really something that approximates spiritual jazz. The next track is The Black Disciple, which was written by Byrd, and it's really quite interesting. Once the head arrangement with the vocal pieces is over, it's basically the modal jazz of the Coltrane and Davis groups, and it's very evocative of the sound of those groups. The final track, Chant, which is Pearson's second composition, has a more kind of perky, upbeat, popish vocal arrangement, and then that gives way to something which is almost like a cool jazz session. It's got a lot of similarity with some of the great work done out in the West Coast some years before, and it's capped by some remarkable turns by Hank Mobley and Kenny Burrell. I don't have many complaints about Blue Note's classic period from 1955 to 1965. You can pretty much pull any record off the shelf in that period and it's going to be good. But if I do have a complaint, I guess it's that there isn't necessarily as much variety as I would like in the catalog, at least until the hard bop formula starts to run out of gas. I do wish Alfred Lyon had been open to more records which took more risks, because this is spectacular. It's a unique record in many respects, whether in Byrd's career or in the Blue Note catalog. I can think of no good reason why it shouldn't be in your jazz collection. And for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.